You're listening to an episode of What on Earth is Going On? This show was originally broadcast on the radio at CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. It is now available to you in this format with all spoken content unabridged. For more information, visit wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Well, good evening. My name is Ben, and it's time for you to strap yourself in for episode number 2 of a new show called What on Earth is Going On? Here on CFRC 101.9 FM, broadcasting to you from Kingston, Ontario. You can stream this live and from the archive at cfrc.ca, and you can listen every Thursday from 6 to 7 p.m. as we try to get to the bottom of the events, the forces, the characters, and the ideas that shape the human story today. I hope you'll get in touch with us about this show. I want to read your comments, your questions, disagreements, contortions, and recommendations for future shows, or even proposals to come on the air yourself. You can find us on social media by searching for What on Earth is Going On, or the show's acronym, WOGO, WOEGO, for What on Earth is Going On. Again, that's WOEGO, or WOGO, so that means that we're at WOGO Show on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, and you can email us at wogoshow@gmail.com. That's WOEGO show@gmail.com. Now, I do look forward to hearing from you, but before you pick up your phone to send me a tweet, which I know you're just dying to do, you might want to listen to this episode first. You might want to think critically about how you engage with social media, with the internet, with technology as a whole. To ask yourself, am I in control of my emotions, of my content, of my data? Do I know why these things are important, or am I being swept away, morphed into a reactive, maybe even primitive dopamine-seeking animal by one of the most powerful, transformative forces ever to shape and challenge our civilization? What on earth is going on with fake news, post-truth, and a new relativism in data, information, journalism, opinion, and fact? How on earth did we get so polarized in our societies and in our politics? Is it getting worse, or are we, by virtue of being in the midst of it, just incapable of seeing this transformation for what it really is? Are these anxieties merely the growing pains of a metamorphosis that will take us far beyond what we can currently conceive? Or are they the signals of something truly dangerous, something that threatens the deep underpinnings of our civilization? What on earth is going on with extremism sharing space with mainstream thought? The kind of extremism that was given no oxygen just a few years ago. First, uncomfortable dinner conversations, and then Twitter trolls, and then online news outlets, and then presidents equivocate on, say, white supremacy. How did we get here? Is this a blip that we'll one day shake off? Or are we reverting wholesale to an earlier version of ourselves? What on earth is going on when most people get their news from Facebook, which can often feel like nothing better than an echo chamber for your own biases? Because we all know news is never just presented as the facts. News is always presented with bias. And then what about these platforms being compromised, whether by data pirates or political operatives or Russian state hackers? How might they be compromised going forward? Have we already let the big corporations like Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Uber get away with too much real-world power, too much data, too much influence on our minds and our habits? The sheer power of these companies and their algorithms mean that they may know us better than we know ourselves. They can influence our thinking through addictive apps and indispensable mobile phones, through nudges in advertising or tweaks to the secret sauce. Our own free will may be at stake. Is it too late to turn back? Are we already too addicted to the technology we have birthed? A technology which has reordered the world in less than a generation. what on earth is going on here? These are the questions we're going to tackle on today's program. Joining me in a few minutes to help crack the nut of social media and the so-called post-truth age is a professor of philosophy at Queen's University in Kingston, Dr. Carlos Prado. We're going to have a fascinating conversation informed not just by the bizarre and dangerous events of our day, but by his whole career spent digging into philosophy and philosophers, such as Michel Foucault. Before we get to that interview, let's set the stage. Technological change has been part of the human story since the very beginning. Even before our species had the power to record our history, we learned to make fire or craft tools, manipulate our environment to improve our chances of survival and reproduction. It could even be argued that technology is our ecological niche. We aren't terribly strong or large or fast. Instead, we have these brains and cognition to go with it. And so we've evolved to become masters of technology, tireless innovators by genetic inheritance. Even language, which forms the basis of everything we are as a civilization, is technological as soon as it is taught or written or recorded. Thus, it wasn't long before, through technology, we cultivated crops and domesticated animals. We built rafts and then boats and then ships for the sea. We moved from stone tools to bronze tools to iron tools. We built the rock circle of Stonehenge and the pyramids of Giza. With improved sanitation, increasing food supplies due to agricultural technology, and medicine to ward off death a little bit longer, our population grew at first comfortably and then exponentially. Our species went from hunter-gatherer to world conqueror in a few thousands of years. But like the expansion of the universe, human technology has not just grown, it has grown at an accelerating rate. The agricultural revolution took millennia. The Iron Age transition took centuries. The Industrial Revolution? Within a few decades of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Britain was transformed. The same throttling wave of change swept over Europe and North America and eventually the world. Some argue that this revolution is ongoing today, especially in places like China, where the migration of people from the countryside to the cities is recognized as the largest short-term movement of humans ever. Yet here's what's important about the Industrial Revolution, which other technological changes before couldn't say. The changes occurred and were noticeable in a single generation. Someone in early 19th century England could be born in one world and die in a whole new one. Today, over 2 centuries since the start of that Industrial Revolution, we now seem to be in the middle of a new one, the Digital Revolution. And the rate of change has accelerated dramatically, not in decades, but in years, maybe even in months. Someone born in a Western nation in 1984, so a millennial, where rotary phones and color television were common, that person turned 18 in a world where basic cell phones were typical and phone books were vanishing. And today she raises a family in a world where the internet and social media are the dominant shapers of social and cultural spheres, where she doesn't remember phone numbers, where the power of massive corporations and government to see, track, and know her is on par with Big Brother. Remember from the book that has the same title as the year that she was born, 1984, by George Orwell. How many more times will her paradigm shift? And what will it all look like when she dies? Or will we have beaten death by then, whether by enhancing her body with biotech or uploading her consciousness to the cloud? I get it. This is all a little bit cliche and overly generalized. But the change in which we process information, develop and share opinions and arguments, and connect to each other socially is undeniable. And this shift occurred in just a few years. Remember the Arab Spring of 2011? It seems like ages ago. Here's what esteemed American broadcaster Dan Rather said not long after. From the streets of Cairo to the Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street, from the busy political calendar to the aftermath of the tsunami in Japan, social media was not just sharing the news, but driving it. What on earth is going on? It's hard to describe the shape of the bubble when you're inside of it. But here's something to chew on. In China, the government is imposing a new system of social credit, which is tied to every individual and linked to their social media presence. They've been working on this for years. So are you getting enough exercise, doing well at your job, paying your bills on time? You get points for that. Are you critical of the government, antisocial, free thinking? You're docked points for that. Now, this whole thing might sound harmless to you, as in, who cares about these social media points? But if you think that, I would encourage you to watch just one episode of a TV show called Black Mirror, called Nosedive. We already rate businesses and Uber drivers. We accept being rated as consumers on TripAdvisor. An expansion wouldn't be too difficult or uncomfortable, frankly. In fact, it's all designed like a game. We might think we're having more fun, in fact. Do you think they'll do it in China but never here? I say people want such a system, especially if it's designed like a game, and even if only for the dopamine fix for when they score. After all, we've given everything else away with our phones and our tablets, and we've made seemingly bigger trade-offs in our collective past. Why not just go full Orwell? All right, Professor Emeritus Carlos Prado was born in Guatemala and immigrated to Canada in 1965. He is a professor of philosophy at Queen's University and has published 20 books on numerous subjects, including the 20th century French philosopher Michel Foucault, assisted dying, the effect of social media, and most recently, the whole meaning behind the post-truth era with his book, America's Post-Truth Phenomenon, When Feelings and Opinions Trump Facts and Evidence. Dr. Prado was named one of the 10 most influential Hispanic Canadians and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Sir, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So we have quite a smorgasbord of things happening in our world today. The rapid transformation of society, the economy, politics, insofar as the digital age, the digital revolution, is changing the way, not only the way we do things, but the way that we interact with each other. So my question, as always, to start off the program is, what on earth is going on?
Well, it's hard to say, but let me begin with something that may surprise you a little bit. My concern is that people don't pay enough attention to how fads and fashions influence them. For instance, you now can buy an electric razor that will leave a 3-day growth on you. Why? My view of this is that as women became more assertive, men began to feel they needed to confirm or assert their own masculinity, and hence the beards. Nobody considers that when they let themselves run around with a 3-day growth of beard. But they're doing it, and it has become popular enough, as I say, that companies are making razors that do that.
That is almost exactly the question that I'm trying to get to, is what's behind the things that we do every day, these things that seem trendy or even meaningless. I mean, I often have a beard. Right now I'm fresh-faced, but I don't really think about why I do that. And so the question, what on earth is going on, really gets to, well, why am I behaving in these ways?
Well, I think one of the things that I learned from Foucault is that we really aren't aware of the way that we are shaped, that our lives are formed, our behavior is conducted by what is around us. Now, in my new book, the one you mentioned, America's Post-Truth Phenomenon, one of the things I try to bring out in that, and it's also in an article I'm doing for the Philosopher's Magazine, is that we are in a time of post-truth. Now, if you want to over-intellectualize the notion of post-truth, you go back to the term postmodern, which literally means after modern, after the modern era, after the objectivity of Cartesian and Kantian philosophy. And what we have now then is a release from that commitment to objectivity. Now, what I think is going on is that shared opinion has replaced objectivity. People no longer corroborate things that they encounter with facts or with states of affairs. What they do now is they share opinions. And what's enabled that is the internet, in particular social media, because you now have access to an incredible number of individuals who are posting daily their views and opinions. You can find opinions there that echo your own, or you can find opinions there that prompt you to think of something that you are inclined to like but hadn't thought of. And you have the authority of others. And that, I think, has replaced. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. When Kelly Ann Conway referred to alternative facts when she was defending Donald Trump, it sounds absurd at first until you plug in this point that I'm making about shared opinion, because then it begins to look as if what she was really talking about was not facts or states of affairs as ordinarily understood, but shared opinions. And there, of course, you do get differences. The only trouble now is that when opinions differ, as for instance mine do with Trump's, you can't then go to the facts. All you can do is either accept the other's view or dismiss it. And that's what people are doing. And that's one of the things that makes the Trump exaggerations in his tweets and so on work so well. No one challenges them. They either accept them or they dismiss them. And it's done.
There is so much in what you just said that I want to unpack. Before I do, I wanted to note something I read recently in the New York Times. They have a newsletter you can subscribe to called The Interpreter. And it's usually about foreign affairs, but they do talk about social media quite a bit and the effect of social media and it has on people all around the world. One of the articles recently talked about lynchings that occur, whether in Central America or Sub-Saharan Africa, where the community will get together and lynch someone, not because they feel they're doing something bad, but in fact they feel they're doing something good. They're executing justice. They're providing security to their community by lynching someone who they see as foreign, perhaps preying on children. And social media has an extremely powerful effect on this because it provides people the information, the impetus, and the feeling that they're right, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. And the expression that this article called upon that I found really interesting was that there is an ideological flattening, that something that is your opinion and something that is a fact are equal, and also that extremist viewpoints are equalized with mainstream viewpoints, and that one isn't valued over the other. Do you see that as accurate as a description of what's going on?
Absolutely. I think that that's dead right. One of the things that I have in the article I was referring to, and that I won't bother looking up right now, but there's a very interesting article about Facebook and about how falsehoods posted on Facebook have prompted arguments and bombings and killings. One of the instances they give is between Muslims and trying to think of what the other side of it was, Buddhists, I think it was, Muslims and Buddhists in Sri Lanka. And they believed Facebook postings about things that one side was doing to the other and vice versa. And this led to killings, bombings, and many deaths. I don't know what's going on there, but I think what is happening is, as I said, that shared opinion has replaced corroboration, has replaced actual facts. And one of the points made in one of the articles that I quote is that social media is prompting people to want to be part of the groups that they that they encounter on social media. It's a question of being a thinking us and them, and that's what's going on.
Tribalism.
Tribalism, exactly. And so your point about the lynchings and so on, it's justified in their view, because what they're doing is they're defending their position, their shared position, against them. And I'm not quite sure what you can do about that.
Well, and this is just a thought I'm having now, that perhaps one of the achievements of human civilization, maybe Western civilization, I'm not really sure, is that prior to the rise of social media and the new digital age, there was a hierarchy of information. That there was a belief that if I read something in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Globe and Mail, that it had at least, I believed that it was corroborated by people behind it, by reporters who had to do their homework, rather than if my neighbor just told me some anecdote about something he saw yesterday. I knew that one was more valuable than the other. But this ideological flattening occurs in social media, where the Globe and Mail article is placed right next to my neighbor's opinion with the same value. And there's also this sense that, well, the Globe and Mail is part of the corrupt elite, and they're just lying to me, and they're just trying to sell newspapers or to sell their advertising. And therefore, my neighbor might actually be more virtuous because at least his story is unbiased and real. So this kind of goes to the heart of what we're talking about. But I wanted to just ask a question beyond this for a second. The rise of social media over the last 10 or 15 years has had a profound effect, but many people will argue, and I guess I'll just play devil's advocate, that the polarization of our society and our politics started before that, and is not just because of social media, that there are other forces at play, and that even if you took social media and the internet out of the equation, the polarization would probably have continued after, say, the Second World War. What do you make of that?
Okay, I think you're right. I think the polarization has always been there, as far back as you can go. The trouble is that what social media has done is that it has enabled it to grow geometrically.
Right.
That's the problem. Let me just very quickly review a couple of points that Foucault makes, which are very relevant to this. First of all, Foucault's view of truth was wholly relativistic. He rejected conception of truth as a confirming relation, between statements and actual states of affairs. Instead, Foucault conceived of truth as a property of statements that meet diverse evaluatory societal standards. Now, just to paraphrase the explanation he gives in Power Knowledge, every society has its own regime of truth, or the sorts of statements that are accepted and function as true. Every society has methods to differentiate true and false statements. Every society has ways of recognizing sanctioned statements. Every society has procedures that are valued in acquisition of truth. And every society has authorities who regulate what counts as true.
Right.
Your point about authority. Now, here's the trick. What has to be added to these 5 points is that regimes of truth are now partly determined by something Foucault did not live to witness. That is the present day of social media, the present day use of social media. What social media have added to determination of regimes of truth is provision of access to others' opinion on an enormous scale. Foucault would have certainly included expression, reiteration, and absorption of opinions on social media sites as determinants of regimes of truth. To one extent or another, all 5 of the determinants Foucault listed are conditioned by use of social media. But the determinant that stands out in consideration of how social media contribute to credulity regarding political contentions, for instance, is the second, namely differentiation of truth and falsity. Because in a word, I believe that a new element has been introduced by social media into how statements are deemed true or false. And that new medium is what I referred to earlier, namely shared opinion.
There was something I mentioned in last week's episode of this show about what Barack Obama claimed was one of the greatest threats to American democracy and prosperity towards the end of his term. I think it was actually after Donald Trump was elected, but before the inauguration. And Barack Obama said that that one of the greatest threats was the erosion of our shared values and understandings, that everyone can pretty much assume that the world is round, back in 2016 at least. Everyone can assume that American democracy will function tomorrow in the same way that it was today. People will also assume that the American candidate for president won't claim to lock up the person he's running against after the election. There are certain assumptions that everyone can kind of agree on, and those who don't agree on it are way out on the fringe, and we don't usually hear from them. They're certainly not published in the papers. And what he said was that these shared values and opinions and ideas are being broken apart and further polarized through the use of social media, and essentially that we don't agree on anything anymore. And I know that that kind of makes a glib point of what you just talked about with Foucault, but I think that the insight is still very clear, that the sense that we are one shared community is being broken, and that I'm just sharing my community with whoever shares my biases on Facebook.
Right, right. Okay, let me make a point about that, which I think is central to what you're saying. And it's something that we saw with Trump's presidential campaign, and certainly something that we continue to see in his incessant tweets and speeches. And that is undermining the value of the press. Your point about objectivity, you see, for most of us in our modern world, the press was an authority. We expected the press to corroborate the data that they proceeded to give us. And one of the first things that happened with the Trump campaign was slamming the press.
Right.
Now, if you look back in the history, and I can tell you from personal experience as a child in Guatemala, the first thing that a tyrant does is precisely undermine the press. Why? Because then the government, you see, is the only source of authority. There is no competition.
Right.
The freedom of the press becomes irrelevant if it isn't trusted. And that's what's going on right now. That is, I think, the main ingredient of what you're talking about, that we are seeing what we used to trust most now becoming untrustworthy. I have been appalled by the number of interviews I've seen on television about people dismissing papers as too liberal, as too conservative. For instance, nobody who reads the New York Times reads the New York Post.
Right.
And vice versa. When I go online, for instance, and look at the Washington Post, and I tell friends about it over lunch, there's always a reaction either of complete agreement with the views expressed or total dismissal of the views expressed. Why? Because the Washington Post is too liberal. I think that is the basic thing that's going on, and we're seeing that really changing our situation.
That's a very interesting point, and I have a personal anecdote for that. Recently, I sent someone, and I won't name them on the show, but if they listen, they know who they are, that I sent a CBC article, which said that the Alberta economy is doing quite well, that the recovery is strong, and the employment numbers are getting better, that the GDP growth is the highest in Canada, so forth and so forth. And my friend refused to read the article because it was in the CBC. So I don't read things that are in the CBC. I don't take anything that they say to mean anything for me. And I said, well, hold on a second. The source for this article is Statistics Canada. So the CBC article is essentially regurgitating what is in a report from Statistics Canada. Are you saying that you don't trust Statistics Canada? Essentially, what he said to me was, well, I'll wait until it comes out in a different publication. But we all know that those who have a different viewpoint than, say, the CBC or don't want to talk about how the Alberta economy is doing better compared to other provinces, they will not publish that report from the Statistics Canada.
That's right.
And we won't see it, or he won't see it. And so then our worldviews are defined not by even if he agrees that Statistics Canada has not been eroded by the liberal elite, even if he agrees with that, he won't indulge in the information until it comes through a publication that he respects and sees as part of his group.
No, I think when you use the word tribalism, I think that's what we're facing. I have a personal experience of this. My brother, who lives in California, is a Trump supporter.
Right.
And he and I can't communicate because when, for instance, I offered to send him my new book, he wanted no part of it because he saw this simply as, the other side.
Huh.
But it's getting worse than this, and this is another point that I want to introduce that is contributing not just to tribalism, but to a really rather scary change in worldview. And that is something that I find impossible to explain, which is malicious falsities on the internet. I have an article, for instance, that came out in the Atlantic, recent Atlantic, titled Reality's End. And what it's about is, I'll just read you the little blurb on it because
please.
It's interesting. It says, the current era of fake news may soon seem quaint. Video manipulation is eroding society's ability to agree on what's true.
Right.
Or what's even real. Now, the point they make in this article, and I found this frightening, is the number of people who put false videos on social media. And it is now an easy matter. For instance, one of the things that they do is they describe a rather unpleasantly sexual video that was put on where certain people's heads were put on other bodies,
right,
engaging in certain activities, and you can't tell the difference. So what kind of confirmation can there be now? Because even if you yourself see the video, that doesn't count anymore.
Right. And it almost goes to the other side of the argument, which is, well, I don't believe anything the government tells me, or I don't believe anything the media tells me. And if it's possible to create a video of, say, the president or the prime minister saying something, which has been proven. I haven't read this particular article, but I know that videos have been created of world leaders, and it's impossible for people to tell the difference between the real thing and the fabricated video, with fabricated voice and fabricated a person actually speaking. Now, if I say to someone, well, I know I read it in an article or I saw them say it, they can say to me, well, yeah, but you don't know that you saw it. I mean, it's making things so morally and so relativistic on every account that I think that we face a great danger because of the use of technology. It's not just social media and the internet. It's the very technology that can reproduce human voice and a human body on screen.
Yeah. Well, this goes back a very long way in terms of one aspect that concerns me a great deal, which is government, because it goes back to Plato. Plato felt that democracy couldn't work because of this kind of thing, and he saw it in terms of numbers, which I think was a very perceptive point. The more people you have, and our population, is heading towards the 50 billion rate or something. The more people you have, the more crucial tribalism becomes, the more important it becomes to be able to trust evidence that you get, for events in question and so forth.
Right.
But also, the greater the tensions. You can't have a country that's democratically ruled if you don't have trust in the press, for instance. Your point about the press goes to this quite directly. Because without the press telling you, for instance, what's behind what politicians are saying,
right,
there's no way that you can make intelligent decisions. All you can do is, again, my point, go with shared opinion. And that simply fosters tribalism to a frightening extent.
Yeah, and it seems that we have, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we saw social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, as these liberating forces. And I remember the Arab Spring in 2011. I actually stayed in Tahrir Square in a hotel in Cairo 3 weeks before the Arab Spring kicked off. And I remember the discussion on the ground at the time was fed through social media. People were reading things that in Egypt that they couldn't read before about Mubarak, the president, and who was soon to be overthrown. And we thought all over the world, well, how wonderful is this that we're breaking down barriers and opening things up. And Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, still talks about this today, about how Facebook is breaking down barriers and opening up the world into a shared community. But I think what we didn't realize at the time was the unintended effects, not just on our democracy, on our politics, on our society, but also on ourselves.
Yes.
That the effect of social media and the internet on our individual selves and how we behave every day is profound. And I know you've written about this before as well, with social media's impact on the brain and on the psychology. I think that we can fit this back into the greater conversation, but let's just take a step back and talk about what effect does social media have on the individual, on the brain?
Well, okay, first of all, your point about the liberation, the greatness of social media when it was first introduced, I thoroughly agree with you on that. What I find interesting is that if you think in terms of the importance, the size, the impact that social media first made, then you begin to realize that the impact it's having now is of the same order. And it's getting worse. What I don't understand is why the malevolence and why people are using it as they're using it now. That's quite beyond me. But the thing that frightens me most about what is going on now is that I still think that social media is great. The trouble is it's being used badly. And the effect that it's having then is undoing all the good stuff that it did. One of the things that's going on, I think, is that people are not thinking deeply enough about what they are picking up on social media. Let me make a point that I suspect that any instructor who's listening will agree with. One of the problems we're facing now, this is not social media as such, this is the internet generally, is that, and don't forget, I was teaching philosophy, so
right.
it's very serious in that respect. One of the things that I think is happening is that too many students are losing understanding of what knowledge is. They're failing to integrate data. Because what's happening is that they think, what's the point of sitting in a lecture when I can Google this stuff and get it immediately? You see? And I do that myself. One of the things I find interesting is sitting at the university club over lunch. How many of us have our cell phones out, Googling terms and ideas and all the rest of it? But my worry with respect to students is that by relying as they do on outfits like Google and so on, they're failing to see that data isn't knowledge.
Right.
Data must be integrated. And without that integration, you lose perception. You can't be perceptive of what's going on because you don't see relationships, you see? And that's one of the things that I think is fostering the sort of tribalism you're talking about. Because what social media presents us with doesn't get integrated with anything. It's just an opinion, that's it. And it's taken as such, and that's it.
I think what you're saying is a cornerstone of epistemology, of that data is not knowledge.
That's right.
That knowledge is both a priori and a posteriori. It comes from the things we know beforehand and the things that we discover after the fact.
Right.
And I think that when it comes to the internet, our phones in our hands at all times, I mean, I've read this many times, that essentially our phone, or whatever it's going to become in the future, whether it's a watch or something we wear over our eyes or a chip in our brain, that it's becoming a memory prosthetic. And if we really don't need to remember anything anymore, whether it's a phone number or some data or a fact or a theory of something, then really memory becomes just as irrelevant as the appendix.
That's right.
And I worry that this is happening prior to evolution. This is happening in the way that we bring ourselves up, the way that we educate ourselves. And I think what I hear you saying is that you can see this happening in the education of students now, today.
I think it is happening. And this brings up my new project. I have a new project on the effects, good and bad effects of technological enabling of things we do.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's going on in this new collection is an article by a guy going on about robots.
Mm.
And one of the things he fears is that it isn't going to be long before robots outstrip us.
Right.
Because they won't have that problem.
Mm-hmm.
Their memory will be integral to what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
whereas ours is becoming redundant, essentially.
Right, and they can store, a robot or a machine can store so much that, as you say, it's irrelevant to their operation. They don't need to discard something in order to remember something new.
That's right.
And I think the rise of AI is another clear answer to the question of what on earth is going on. That we have a rise. I mean, the idea that a general artificial intelligence is coming but hasn't come yet may be something we can talk about going forward and will happen in 5 or 10 or 50 years or whatever. But the fact remains that artificial intelligence exists in Google and Facebook, and it actually enhances and imposes upon us as the users of these tools opinions that we may not have had before. And it releases us of the need to do something. And I guess I'll quote something, or not quote something, but paraphrase what a lot of people in Silicon Valley say, which is that, yeah, it is a memory prosthetic. You can Google these things, and that's a good thing, because why do you want to remember a phone number? Or why do you want to remember the capital of Mongolia? Or why do you need to store this information? Wouldn't you rather free up your mind to do other things? And it sounds to me a suspicious argument, because that's almost like saying to somebody, well, why ride a bike in the gym, or why go for a run when you can just take an exercise pill? It seems to me that, okay, if you take an exercise pill, you might be gaining some of the same advantages, but you're forgetting that exercise is a very different beast. It's almost like what the builder of the IBM computer that beat human beings at Jeopardy. He was asked, is this machine conscious? Is it sentient? And he said, well, in answer to your question, can a submarine swim? Well, no, of course a submarine can't swim, but it does all the same things that a swimmer does.
Well, your point about consciousness is an interesting one, because one of the things that I think may be happening, not in the next 100 years, but soon enough, is that if we continue in this process, I suspect that our consciousness will change. That our consciousness will become essentially more animalistic. It'll be concerned only with immediacies like hunger and pain and warmth and so on.
And lynchings.
And lynchings, because we'll become more reactive. I don't know how to answer the question about why remember a phone number or the capital of a country. Part of it is it's there. It's important to the extent to which it is part of what makes you who you are, in the sense that the things that you remember, the things that are there that stand out a little bit more, are part of what determines your personality. And if that begins to go away, your personality begins to go away. It's a sad thing to think of. It's like your cell phone. Why do you have all that stuff in it? I mean, why do you have all those pictures, for instance, or songs you like or whatever? You can get them easily. No, you want them there because they are part of what you are.
Yeah. They're your hoard almost. They're your material wealth. I have 100,000 photos of me, and I can identify with myself as such because I don't know how to create an identity in any other way, maybe.
Well, the older you get, the more you realize how important this stuff is, because as your memory begins to fail and you begin to lose things, for instance, the names of people or who did what, when, and that sort of thing, you begin to appreciate how precious those memories are. But more important, you begin to lament that you're losing part of who you are. That's I think the crucial point.
I find this fascinating, in part because I've never heard it framed this way. That what we're dealing with is perhaps a reversion to an older form of living, an older form of being human. That our consciousness is receding into something more primitive, more immediate, more reactive. And that actually makes sense, because what a lot of people are finding, that the reason that Facebook and Twitter and social media and the internet in general, or Reddit, is so prone to being hijacked by negative emotions, whether they're fear or anger, is because these programs are built on getting the highest engagement possible.
Right.
So
right.
what you want as the user, and what Facebook wants as the platform, is to have a post, a picture and a comment, or a caption underneath that garners the highest possible engagement,
right.
that has the closest to viral as possible. I mean, I think it would be anyone's dream to have, who's a user, to have a viral video or a viral photo, but it's also the platform's interest in that as well. The problem is that in negative emotions like fear and anger drive engagement more than other emotions, in the same way that bright colors do on your phone or on your screen. If you see bright colors, you're more likely to get a dopamine fix, and if you see something that's angry or fearful, then you're more likely to get your little fix from that moment. And I've actually heard it suggested that you should turn your phone to a black and white screen so that you're less addicted to it. Which I found fascinating, and I've actually done on my phone, and I guess we'll see if it works. But the problem with these platforms is that they're going to the lowest common denominator of our personalities and
That's
of our
right.
societies.
That's right.
So it sounds like you agree with that, and that
definitely,
may be the problem.
Definitely. I also see another area of difficulty, which brings us back to technology and robots and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
One of the articles written for me for this new project points out the likelihood of employment being reduced by as much as a third,
right,
in the next bunch of years, because of robots doing all kinds of work. Now, what's scary about that is idleness. Mm-hmm. Because one of the problems and one of the reasons that I worry about, for instance, another article I quote here, which I won't bother with right now, is that teenagers now are using up to 9 hours a day. Imagine that, 9 hours a day on social media. What are we talking about here? We're talking about idleness. We're talking about people who are becoming more recipients than activists. They sit and watch television. They're on social media. They're not doing anything active. They're not doing anything that drives them
right
to improve themselves, to do something better. And if the employment rate does reduce that way, we're going to have a real problem with that. So this business about retrogressing in evolution is very worrying when it looks as if we're becoming observers.
Well, and I think it might also be a boon to autocracy, whether that's
for sure.
human autocracy or robot-controlled autocracy, say something like in The Matrix, where we're all plugged in. Because if you think about it, if you have a huge amount of people around the world who are all of a sudden unemployed because of the rise of automation and all of this idleness, well, you need to have these people do something other than lynch people, for example. You need to maintain order and stability, whether you're a computer program or you're a human government. You know that people need this, and I think that maybe it's just keep them plugged in and at least channel their behavior on Facebook or Twitter in a positive way, maybe.
Well, let me finish up with just one point that I think is important to make. A lot of people listening will feel that our negativity is overdone about technology, about the internet, and so on. This is a mistake. It's a misperception, because it's not a matter of lamenting technology or lamenting social media. It's a question of how it's being used.
Right.
That's what's important. And the thing that we have to get across is that we have now tremendous benefits in social media, in technology, and all the rest of it. The issue has to be, how do we use them? How do we employ them? How do we make them make us better rather than lessen us? That's the crucial thing.
It reminds me of a book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which was actually, is that not a new book? And in that book, Robert Pirsig talks about the same thing, that it's technology itself is not good or bad. It's neutral. It's nothing.
Right.
It's our use of it. It's our attitude towards it that matters. And that book, I think, was from the 1970s, if I remember correctly.
I'm amazed you read it. I read it back then, and I thought exactly what you're saying.
It's fascinating. I read that book. I was finishing the book as I was flying into San Francisco, and of course, the book ends when he arrives in San Francisco as the great, the final revelation, I think, from what I remember. Yeah. Dr. Prado, thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure.
You've got a book coming, just to remind our listeners. It's called America's Post-Truth Phenomenon, When Feelings and Opinions Trump Facts and Evidence. It's a pretty clever title, and apparently you can find this on Amazon. Is that right?
Yep, Amazon.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and hope to have you again.
Thank you.
All right, that's our show for the evening. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen here on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston. Streaming live all the time from cfrc.ca. Remember to check us out on social media. Look up What on Earth is Going On, or find at Wogo Show on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or email wogoshow@gmail.com. Wogo as in What on Earth is Going On, WOEGO. Would love to hear your comments, your suggestions, your questions, and your quote of the day. Today is an aphorism straight out of Silicon Valley, and you've probably heard it before, but it bears repeating. If you are not paying for the product, you are the product. See you next week. Good night. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, visit wogoshow.com, that's WOEGO show.com, or search for What on Earth is Going On in your podcast provider. See you next time.